Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about human sexuality, and I'm going to talk about sexual orientation in this video as well, and some of the reasons why people do have different sexual orientations. So first of all, I'm going to talk about our sexual behavior, and why is it that we're even talking about it in this chapter on motivation and emotion. But really, our sexual drive is a powerful motivator, and that's why it's in this chapter on motivation and emotion. So we know that hormones play an important role in our sexual drive, primarily testosterone for both men and women. We always think of men as having testosterone, but women also have testosterone, and it is also involved in women's sexual drive as well. So the hypothalamus that was involved in eating is also involved in releasing hormones involved in sexual desire, and it controls our ability to actually engage in sex as well. So the amygdala is also involved in motivating sexual behavior and desire. And if you remember, the amygdala is the emotional center of our brain. So it's an interesting part of our sexuality. Masters and Johnson's was one of the first, actually Alfred Kinsey was one of the first to actually study sexuality. Masters and Johnson studied it after him. Masters and Johnson was really looking more at the physical sexual response and how the sexual response cycle, and their book goes into detail about this if you're really interested in it. And they were also looking at sexual disorders and sexual dysfunction. And of course, they were made fun of at the time, and they were called perverts and things like that. But they really wanted to understand different problems that people were having with their sexuality. And their sexual functioning, not so much their sexuality, but their sexual functioning. Alfred Kinsey did a really comprehensive sexuality survey in 1948, and he was definitely controversial at the time, and people were pretty shocked by some of his findings. So his first study was called Sexual Behavior in the Human Male, and it was done in 1948. And then the Sexual Behavior in the Human Female was done in 1953. And he surveyed, I don't know how many people, it doesn't say on here, but he surveyed thousands of people about their sexual practices, and found a lot of kind of surprising things for 1948. He said that, there are many people that are exclusively heterosexual, but there's a lot of people in between that too. I think that the assumption at that time was that everybody was exclusively heterosexual. But he said that there are people that are heterosexual that have homosexual experiences, that there are bisexual people, and that there are people that are exclusively homosexual and mostly homosexual. And then he also talked about asexuality, which we'll talk about in the next slide too. But people are not exclusively either heterosexual or homosexual, that there's a whole range. Now, there are people that are exclusively one or the other, and that's perfectly okay. But what he discovered is that there's a huge range, and that it's, that all of those are part of a range of normal sexual behavior. So sexual orientation is kind of what we talked a little bit about there, but you guys probably already know this information. So heterosexual means you're attracted to members of the opposite sex. Homosexual means you're attracted to members of the same sex. Bisexual means you're attracted to both. Asexual is something that might be surprising to you, but there are people that don't have a lot of sexual attraction towards other people. They actually have no sexual attraction towards other people. They don't experience sexual desire. Kinsey found that it was 1.5% of the population in 1948. They think it's around 1% today when they've done more studies on that, but it is something that there hasn't been a ton of research on. But there are many people that don't have that sexual drive. We all have different sexual drives, and that's something that is asexuality a problem that needs to be fixed, or is it okay is that just part of the normal continuum of sexuality as well? We definitely have different sexual drives. Some people have much stronger drives than others, and some people have not very much of a drive at all. We're all very different in that way. And so this is talking about asexuality. Is it a disorder, a dysfunction, or is it part of the normal range of sexuality? And we're still kind of researching that. And could asexuality be associated with being abused as a child, sexually abused as a child? Could it be a psychological disorder or sexual shaming as a child, or really firm, strong religious beliefs against sexuality? Could be any number of those things, or it could be completely normal as well. But definitely there are lots of facets to our sexual orientation and to our sexual drive as well. So your sexual orientation is an enduring pattern of sexual and romantic and emotional attraction to people, either of the same sex or the opposite sex or both sexes. And it's 3 to 10% of the population identify as homosexual. That's quite a huge range. And I think people are much more open about their sexuality today. They feel much safer in sharing their sexuality. So hopefully we'll get that number a little bit more accurate these days. But how does sexual orientation develop? I'm going to show you, I have a video that I'll post after this video lecture that talks about some of the research and what we have discovered about the roots basically, and I shouldn't say the causes of sexual orientation, but how it develops, because it's not considered a disorder. It's considered a normal part of our sexuality. So how does sexual orientation develop? So research demonstrates that sexuality is not a matter of choice, but of biology. People are born with their sexual orientation, and there's still a lot of people in society that aren't accepting of that, although there's many churches and many parts of society that are now recognizing that this is a normal part of sexuality. They're not doing anything against God, and that it's not for us to judge people of different sexual orientations. Just because we don't have that experience doesn't mean that other people don't legitimately have a different experience than we do. So we know that there are prenatal hormonal influences in utero. So when the baby is developing in mom's womb, that if they don't get enough testosterone or they get too much female hormones, that can change a child's sexuality. The video that I showed you, they actually did an experiment with rats and deprived them of particular hormones at birth, and actually created a homosexual rat. So we know that there's a really huge impact of hormones during that prenatal period before the baby's even born. We also know there's genetic influences. Twin studies and genealogy studies suggest that there's definitely a genetic component. It runs in families. You definitely see that with lesbian women and also with homosexual men, not just women and not just men. We've also done some research in trying to identify brain differences. And going back to the genetic influences, we have not been able to identify genes and hardly any disorders yet. So there's not a gay gene or a particular gene that makes somebody gay. But we do know that it runs in families. There's definitely a strong genetic component to it. And then we've also looked at different parts of the brain. So the hypothalamus we know is involved in sexual desire and hunger and all sorts of things, as well as the amygdala. And the corpus callosum is that part of the brain that connects both halves of the brain. And we found that those 3 things are different in gay men and straight men, and that transgender individuals also show brain differences. So we don't know exactly why they're showing those differences and what those differences mean, but clearly there probably is some differences in brain structure, differences in hormones, and differences in how things work. So the hypothalamus is active in the release of hormones for sexual desire, it appears that there's an area in the hypothalamus that has to do with attraction to women, and it has fewer connections in gay men versus straight men. So that might explain something. The corpus callosum, the part of the brain that holds those 2 halves of the brain together and that allows communication between both sides of the brain, is thicker in gay men. So it's got greater connectivity on it's just got greater, it's thicker, it's got greater connectivity between those 2 sides of the brain. Couldn't read my own writing. So, and then the amygdala is that emotional center of the brain that's definitely involved in sexual desire. And there's a study here that shows that homosexual brains and the amygdala in that homosexual brain looks different than somebody that's heterosexual, and that they're structured more like the opposite sex. So let me try to explain what I'm saying. So a heterosexual male, this is activity in the amygdala here, in the left amygdala, the right amygdala, and then we look at a homosexual male, and you see a whole lot of different things. But you look at a homosexual female, the heterosexual male's brain looks very similar to the homosexual female, and this is the amygdala activity in that brain. And then the heterosexual female and the homosexual male look very, very similar. So it's the same sort of brain activity in the opposite sex of the heterosexual versus the homosexual person. So we know there's some changes and some differences in the amygdala as well. So we know that hormones definitely play a large role in determining sexual orientation. The hypothalamus plays a role in sexual attraction, and differences have been found in gay men. There's more connections in certain areas, less than in other areas versus straight men. We know genetics plays a role, and that research has really discovered, and most psychologists believe that the roots of sexual orientation are biological, and gender identity as well, and that they really exist at birth. There's been a horrible history of what they call conversion therapy. Many churches and organizations have been involved in trying to convert gay people and make them straight, and they have found that it's really, really damaging to people. It doesn't work, and it's been made illegal in many states because it's ineffective and damaging to people who are homosexual. There's still a lot of discrimination against people of different sexual orientations. I think it's better, but it's still not great. And sexual differences in sexual orientation and homosexuality are universal across all countries and throughout history. There's documentation of different sexual practices, throughout time and throughout the world. Homosexuality used to be considered a psychological disorder, which is kind of our bad. The DSM-5, which is the Diagnostical and Statistical Manual for Psychological Disorders, had this as a diagnosis up until 1973, which wasn't that long ago. In Britain, it was illegal to be gay until 1967. I put this picture of the Imitation Game, which I think was World War II, and the main character here was gay, and he spent much of his time making sure that nobody knew that he was gay, and being very afraid. He could have been arrested and put in prison for being gay in 1967. Pretty terrible. So there's still a lot of stereotyping, there's still a lot of prejudice and discrimination against people of different sexual orientations. And this is just kind of an example of different things that have happened to people of different sexual orientations. And I hope that the world's becoming a better place. Today, kids, young adults are coming out and embracing their sexuality at a much earlier age than they did before. Many of you probably experienced clubs in high school for people of different sexual orientations, and I think that that's a really good thing. There have been huge rates of suicide for young adults coping and trying to come to terms with their sexuality, and I think it's really important that young adults are really supported through this process and know that that they're okay, and they're valuable, and there's nothing wrong with having a different sexual orientation. And people are much more supportive of same-sex marriages today. Many churches actually support people of different sexual orientations. I took a picture of this when I was driving home from work one day. This is at 7th Avenue in Glendale. And the church is really saying that we stand on the side of love, whether it's a heterosexual couple or a homosexual couple, that love is love, and they're certainly right. So I hope that we are living in a better world today. Thanks for listening.